The calm before the storm. Blake County was a peaceful town, where life moved at a comfortable, predictable pace. Its people were familiar with each other, and the police precinct was just another part of the scenery, a building that housed those who kept the peace. On the outside, nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary, but Benny James knew better. He had spent nearly 2 decades climbing the ranks of law enforcement, and if there was one thing he had learned, it was that appearances could be deceiving. Beneath the calm surface of this sleepy town, a storm was waiting to break. Benny had recently been appointed as the chief of police, a role he'd dreamed of for years. At 47, he was no stranger to authority. His rise had been slow and deliberate, there had been no shortcuts, no favors. Just hard work, integrity, and a fierce belief that law enforcement could be a force for good. But Benny wasn't interested in becoming one of the countless chiefs who sat behind desks, pushing papers and managing crises from afar. He didn't want to be a face that blended into the walls. He wanted to know who his officers really were, what they were really like, when they didn't have the weight of his position looming over them. So today, he had decided to make an unannounced visit to the precinct. No uniform, no badge, no title. Just Benny James. Just a man in black jeans and a leather jacket, blending in as much as he could. He had a purpose. His mission was simple, to observe, to gauge the authenticity of his team, and to test the waters. It wasn't a typical method. It wasn't the protocol that anyone would have suggested, least of all a chief. But Benny wasn't most chiefs. He had learned the hard way that sometimes, in order to understand the truth, you had to step outside the conventional. The uniform could only hide so much about the man beneath it, and Benny was about to peel back that layer. He walked into the precinct like any other citizen, carrying nothing but his thoughts and an unspoken question: would they recognize him as someone who belonged, or would they see him as a stranger? The interior of the precinct was almost exactly as Benny had remembered it from his early days. The walls, adorned with faded motivational posters and photos of past officers, felt oddly comforting. The hum of daily operations surrounded him. A few officers were gathered around the coffee machine, gossiping. Others were hunched over paperwork or speaking into their radios, but no one looked up as he passed by. Benny took it all in, the mundane, the ordinary, and felt a deep sense of resolve settle within him. This would be his test. The further Benny walked into the precinct, the more he began to feel the weight of his decision. Was this too reckless? Too dangerous? He couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. He was already deep in the belly of the beast. After a few moments of casual wandering, he found himself near the break room. From inside, he could hear laughter, loud, raucous laughter that belonged to 2 men he had seen around the precinct before. They were Officers Grant and Lawson, 2 relatively new recruits, still eager to make their mark in the department. From what Benny had observed, they were good at following orders but lacked the maturity needed to understand the greater purpose of their job. They were still learning the difference between being a cop and being a leader, and Benny wasn't sure they were aware of the responsibility that came with the badge. Benny paused outside the door, listening to their banter. It wasn't malicious, at least not at first. But something about their tone set off a warning bell in his mind. He couldn't put his finger on it yet, but he had a feeling that these 2 would be trouble. "Hey, look at this guy," Officer Grant said, loud enough for Benny to hear. "You lost, pal? This isn't exactly a tourist spot." Benny's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't flinch. He was prepared for this. He had anticipated this reaction, and now, he could either let it slide or take control. He straightened his shoulders and pushed open the door, stepping into the room with an air of nonchalance. The 2 officers turned to face him. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and amusement. Grant, the larger of the 2, smirked as he set his coffee cup down on the counter. "Well, look what we got here," Grant said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Another lost soul trying to find his way around our lovely little station." Benny didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied them with a calm intensity. He could see the glint of superiority in their eyes, the sense of power that only came from wearing the uniform and knowing that they could get away with almost anything. These were men who felt comfortable in their own skin, sure in the belief that they were untouchable. And at that moment, Benny knew something they didn't: their confidence was about to be shattered. "Is there something I can help you with?" Benny finally asked, his voice low and measured. Grant leaned back, giving Benny a once-over. "Nah, we're good. Just wondering what you're doing here. You look like you're in the wrong place." Benny smiled, a tight, controlled smile. "I'm just here to check things out. See how the precinct runs when the boss isn't around." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Officer Lawson's eyes narrowed, but he was the first to break the tension with a laugh. "Guess it's good we don't have the boss here, huh?" Lawson said, nudging Grant with his elbow. "Could you imagine if he found out we were messing with some random guy?" The two officers chuckled, completely unaware of the storm they had just unleashed. Benny didn't move. His gaze didn't waver, and his smile didn't falter. This was a test. A test of their character. But Benny didn't expect them to pass. Grant's smile deepened as he crossed the room toward a nearby locker. "Well, buddy," he said, "since you seem so lost, how about we make sure you don't wander off again?" Without another word, he reached for a rusty, old ball and chain, a piece of equipment that had been collecting dust in the corner of the room for years. The irony of it all wasn't lost on Benny. These officers thought they were going to have a little fun. They thought they were in control, just two regular cops in a regular precinct, playing their games. But Benny James wasn't just any man. And he wasn't about to let this pass without making them understand the consequences of their actions. Grant approached Benny with the ball and chain, a smug grin on his face. "Don't worry, pal," he said. "This is just a little reminder about respect." Benny didn't flinch. He didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot as Officer Grant placed the cold metal around his ankle, the weight of the chain pulling him down. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed in the room. It was a mocking, harsh sound, one that would normally send a message of submission. But Benny James wasn't going to submit. Not today. Not ever. He stood there for a moment, letting the officers believe they had won. Their laughter filled the room as they stepped back, clearly pleased with themselves. But Benny wasn't angry. He wasn't humiliated. Instead, he was calculating. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. They didn't know it yet, but they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. With the ball and chain weighing him down, Benny turned and began walking toward the exit of the break room, his steps slow and deliberate. "You'll regret this," Benny said quietly, his voice carrying a promise. "You'll learn the truth soon enough." The officers didn't take him seriously. But Benny wasn't concerned with their immediate reaction. This was just a setup. This was just the first move in a game they hadn't even begun to understand. In the coming hours, they would learn exactly who Benny James was and what it meant to underestimate the wrong man. And when they did, they would wish they had never chained him up in the first place. The reveal. The air in the precinct had shifted. Benny James, walking away with the rusty ball and chain dragging behind him, had made an impression, though the two officers, Grant and Lawson, didn't yet realize the gravity of the situation. They were too busy laughing, too caught up in their own sense of superiority. They believed that chaining him up was just a harmless joke, something to get a rise out of him. But Benny knew something they didn't: this was far from harmless. This was a pivotal moment, one that would unravel in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. As Benny walked slowly through the hallway of the precinct, he felt the weight of the ball and chain. The cold metal wrapped around his ankle, dragging behind him with every step. But it wasn't just the physical weight that concerned him. It was the symbolic weight, the message that these two officers had sent, thinking they were untouchable. Benny had no intention of letting that stand. His plan had already begun to form in his mind. The confrontation was only a small part of it. What he needed now was patience. He couldn't reveal who he was just yet. If he did, they might think this was all just a misunderstanding, that he was some other officer they had misjudged. No, Benny had to let them stew in their own arrogance for a while longer. He would wait. The storm would come, but it would come on his terms. Passing by a few more officers, Benny caught their eyes. Some gave him curious glances, but none seemed to take notice of the ball and chain, at least not immediately. He moved through the halls like an ordinary man, blending into the background, just as he had planned. His adrenaline was starting to surge again, but this time, it was a slow burn. Benny had seen his fair share of tough situations, but there was something uniquely satisfying about orchestrating this one. It was a test of not just his authority but of their character. And Benny was determined to make sure it would not go unnoticed. He reached the front desk, where a few officers were seated, their attention divided between paperwork and the low hum of chatter in the precinct. Benny stood still for a moment, considering his next move. He needed to make sure everyone knew what was about to happen. Not just Grant and Lawson, but the whole precinct. It was time to turn the tables, to pull back the veil and let them see who Benny really was. He walked to the desk, leaning against it casually, watching the officers as they glanced at him with mild curiosity. Benny didn't break his gaze as he addressed one of them, Officer Evans, a seasoned cop who had been with the precinct longer than most. "Hey, Evans," Benny said, his voice calm. "How's the day going so far?" Evans looked up, blinking in confusion, then quickly glanced at Benny's leg. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of the ball and chain. It's going, all right," he replied, clearly unsure what to make of Benny's appearance. "What's with the chain?" Benny allowed himself a small, controlled smile. "Just a little reminder," he said cryptically. Evans seemed to sense there was more to the story, but he didn't press. Benny could see the gears turning in the officer's mind, trying to piece things together. It was only a matter of time before the entire precinct knew that something was amiss. Without giving Evans a chance to ask further questions, Benny turned and walked down the hallway, his slow, deliberate steps drawing the attention of every officer he passed. Some stared openly, some whispered to each other, but no one said a word. The chain, dragging noisily along the floor, was starting to make its presence known. And Benny was okay with that. At last, Benny reached the office of his two would-be tormentors, Grant and Lawson. He could feel the tension building as he approached. Inside, the officers were seated at their desks, casually talking, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. With a deep breath, Benny pushed the door open. The moment they saw him standing in the doorway, the laughter died in their throats. The sight of the ball and chain locked around Benny's ankle was enough to stop them in their tracks. "Grant, Lawson," Benny said coolly, his voice cutting through the silence. "We need to talk." The two officers stood up, instantly shifting from a state of casual amusement to one of discomfort. Benny watched them for a moment, enjoying the way the color drained from their faces. This was the moment of reckoning, the moment they would realize just how badly they had miscalculated. Grant opened his mouth to speak, but Benny raised a hand to silence him. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his tone measured but firm. "You thought you could have some fun. You thought you could treat me like some nobody you could push around." Benny took a step closer to their desks, his eyes never leaving theirs. "But you're wrong. You've got no idea who I really am." Grant swallowed, his bravado faltering as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Lawson, on the other hand, had started to backpedal, his earlier smirk now replaced by a nervous twitch. "Listen, man," Lawson stammered, clearly trying to defuse the tension. "It was just a joke. We didn't know who you were." Benny shook his head, disappointment flashing in his eyes. It wasn't just a joke. It was a test. And you failed. He turned away, pacing slowly across the room, letting his words hang in the air. You don't understand what it means to have power, do you? You think because you wear a badge, you can do whatever you want. But let me tell you something, this job, this badge, it's not about authority. It's about respect. Benny stopped at the window, his back to the officers. You don't get to decide who's a somebody or a nobody. You don't get to chain anyone up like they're nothing. And you sure as hell don't get to think you can walk away unscathed when you do. He turned back to face them, his eyes locked on theirs with an intensity that made both men take an involuntary step back. I am Benny James, he said, his voice now a sharp, commanding presence that filled the room. And you, Grant Lawson, you've just made a grave mistake. The words seemed to hit them like a freight train. Their faces, once filled with arrogance, now betrayed a mix of shock and fear. It wasn't just the revelation of his identity, it was the realization that they had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. For a long moment, the room was silent. Benny could see the gears turning in their minds, but he wasn't interested in their apologies or excuses. He had already decided what the consequences would be. I don't want your apology, Benny said, his voice cutting through the silence. What I want is for you to understand the gravity of what you've done. And I want you to learn what happens when you treat people with disrespect. This is a lesson, one I hope you'll never forget. Grant opened his mouth to speak, but Benny held up a hand, silencing him once more. I'm not here to discuss this further. You'll have to answer for your actions. In due time. He turned on his heel and made his way back toward the door. I'm going to give you two a chance to think about this. Reflect on it. And when I return, we'll see if you've learned anything. With that, Benny walked out of the office, leaving Grant and Lawson standing there, frozen in place, their minds racing with the implications of what had just transpired. Benny had made his point, he wasn't just the boss. He was the storm they never saw coming. The consequences. The precinct was buzzing with activity, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. Benny James had left the officers in his wake, leaving them shaken, but the ripple effect had begun. As he walked back down the hallway, his mind was already at work, calculating the next step in his plan. He wasn't going to let this incident slide, no, this was an opportunity to teach the whole precinct a lesson about respect, authority, and the true meaning of power. Benny had always believed that leadership was more than just managing people, it was about earning their trust, their respect, and their loyalty. If you abused that power, it would come back to haunt you. He had seen too many officers who let their badges go to their heads, who mistook their position for something more than it was. And now, it was his turn to show them all how easily power could slip from your hands if you weren't careful. The ball and chain still dragged behind him, a constant reminder of what had transpired just moments ago. But Benny didn't feel burdened by it. No, if anything, it was empowering. It was a symbol of how quickly the tables could turn, how easily someone who thought they were in control could be reduced to a powerless figure. And Benny was going to make sure everyone saw it. As he walked past the officers in the hallway, he noticed their glances. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with hesitation. The ripple effect had begun. They were starting to piece together the puzzle. The man they had seen walking through the precinct wasn't just some random guy off the street, he was Benny James, the newly appointed chief of police. And they were beginning to realize just how badly they had misjudged him. Benny didn't stop to address any of them. He didn't need to. His actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. The only thing left to do now was to wait and let the story spread. He reached his office, the door creaking slightly as he pushed it open. The room was quiet, but Benny could feel the weight of the silence. He had a lot to think about, but first, he needed to take a few moments to regain his composure. He sat behind his desk and stared out the window, the view of the precinct lot just visible in the distance. It wasn't a glamorous job. It wasn't about power or prestige, it was about service. And if today had proven anything, it was that there were still officers who didn't understand that. Minutes passed, and as the precinct slowly returned to its rhythm, Benny's phone rang. It was a call he had been expecting. "Chief James," a voice said on the other end. "It's Officer Evans. I think we need to talk." Benny leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling in front of his face as he thought about the conversation he was about to have. Evans wasn't the problem, at least not in the same way that Grant and Lawson were. But even so, it was clear that Evans had witnessed something that shook him. The call was just a formality, but it was an important one. Benny wasn't going to let this go unanswered. "Evans," Benny replied calmly, his voice cool. "What's on your mind?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Evans spoke again. "Look, Chief, I don't know what happened earlier, but I've been hearing some things around the station. People are talking about the incident with Grant and Lawson. And I gotta say, I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that. I mean, I don't know if anyone else could have kept their cool like you did." Benny chuckled softly. "You're right about one thing, Evans. It wasn't an easy situation. But sometimes, you've got to show people that you're not someone they can walk over. You can't let them think they can just do whatever they want." Evans was quiet for a moment. "I get that, Chief. But what are you going to do about Grant and Lawson? They're still talking like it's no big deal." Benny's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'll be handling them. Don't worry about that. They've got a lesson to learn, and I'll make sure they learn it." Evans didn't respond immediately, but Benny could tell the officer was still processing everything. "I just don't get it, Chief," Evans said finally. "How did we get to this point? We're supposed to be a team, you know? I've been here for years, and I've never seen anything like this." Benny leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk as he spoke with conviction. "Because there are still people who don't understand the responsibility that comes with wearing this badge," he said, his voice low but firm. "They think it's about control, about being in charge. But what they fail to realize is that true authority comes from respect, not from intimidation." Evans was quiet for a moment, taking in Benny's words. "I hear you, Chief," he finally replied. "I just hope we can work this out. I don't want to see the precinct fall apart because of a couple of bad apples." "Neither do I," Benny said. "But the truth is, you can't let bad behavior slide. If you do, it'll spread. And before you know it, the whole precinct will be rotting from the inside out. I've got a responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen." With that, the conversation ended. Benny set the phone down, his mind already moving toward the next phase of his plan. Grant and Lawson had made a grave mistake, but they weren't the only ones who needed to be held accountable. The entire precinct had been complicit, whether they realized it or not. It wasn't enough to punish just the two officers. Benny needed to send a message to everyone, to show them that respect and accountability were non-negotiable. The phone call had given him some insight into how the rest of the officers were reacting. They were confused, unsure of what was happening. Some of them had likely never seen someone stand up to authority in this way, at least not from within their own ranks. But Benny knew that the longer the uncertainty lingered, the better. It would keep everyone on edge, keep them guessing. And when the time was right, he would make his next move. Grant and Lawson were still oblivious to the storm that was brewing. But Benny wasn't worried about them anymore. He had other plans, ones that would affect every single officer in that precinct. The breaking point. The next morning, the air in Blake County's police precinct felt different. There was an unspoken tension that lingered over the building, like the heavy stillness before a thunderstorm. Officers moved with purpose, their footsteps louder than usual, their voices more cautious. The routine that had once been so comforting now seemed fragile, as if something was about to shatter at any given moment. Benny James knew this was the perfect opportunity. The uncertainty, the fear, the whispers, these were all part of the plan. But Benny wasn't going to wait for the storm to come to him. He was going to bring it directly to the officers who had yet to fully grasp the lesson he had been trying to teach. He wasn't about to let them forget. It wasn't long before the phone on Benny's desk rang again, this time with an unfamiliar number. He knew who it was before he picked it up. Officer Grant was finally ready to face the music. Benny smiled to himself, not out of malice, but because he knew this would be the moment that made everything clear. "Chief James," Grant's voice came through, shaky but trying to sound composed. I'd like to apologize for what happened yesterday. It wasn't right, and I should have known better." Benny leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Apology accepted," he replied coolly. "But it's not about you admitting that you were wrong. It's about understanding why what you did was wrong in the first place." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Benny could almost hear Grant trying to figure out what the real message was, what the consequences might be. But Benny wasn't going to make this easy. He wasn't just going to let Grant off the hook with a few words of contrition. "You thought you could push me around," Benny continued, his voice deliberate and calm, each word measured. "You thought you could treat me like a joke, like some nobody who didn't deserve respect. But here's the truth, you made a mistake, Grant. A big one. And now, it's time for you to learn what happens when you cross that line." Grant's breath caught. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Benny stood up from his desk and walked toward the window, looking out at the bustling precinct below. "What I mean is this, I'm not going to let this go. I'm not going to let you or anyone else in this precinct believe that kind of behavior is acceptable. You think it's just a matter of authority, of being the boss? You're wrong. It's about the culture we build here, the respect we give each other, no matter who we are or what our rank is." Grant was silent for a long moment, unsure how to respond. But Benny could hear the anxiety in his voice when he spoke again. "I understand, Chief," Grant said, his words reluctant. "I messed up. But, what do you want me to do now? What's next?" Benny took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had been thinking about the next steps for hours, trying to decide how to make the point stick. "You'll see soon enough," he said cryptically. "But this isn't just about you, Grant. This is about everyone in this precinct. You're going to be the first lesson. And after that, we'll see who else is willing to learn." The line went silent again, and Benny knew that Grant was probably trying to piece together what he meant. But Benny wasn't interested in explaining further. He had no time for half-measures or vague gestures of contrition. If Grant was truly sorry, if he truly understood the weight of his actions, he would have to prove it. After hanging up the phone, Benny took a moment to reflect. It was time to set the stage for the next phase of his plan. He needed to make an example of Grant, and then, the rest of the precinct would follow. There would be no more tolerance for arrogance, no more room for those who thought they could get away with pushing others around. It was time to make Blake County's police department a place where respect and responsibility weren't just words, but actions. Benny called Officer Evans into his office, knowing that he would need an ally in the coming days. Evans had been a quiet observer, but Benny could see that the officer had potential. He wasn't one of the ones who would become part of the problem. He was a good cop at heart. Benny needed someone like that to help ensure the message would reach the rest of the precinct. "Evans, come in," Benny called, gesturing to the seat across from his desk. Evans entered cautiously, his expression neutral but alert. He had seen the tension in the air, and he knew that something was about to happen. "Chief, you wanted to see me?" Evans asked, his voice calm, but with a note of uncertainty. Benny nodded. "Yeah, I've been thinking. We've got a problem in this precinct, and it's not just about a couple of bad officers. It's a problem with how we see authority, how we understand respect. Grant and Lawson? They're just the tip of the iceberg. We need to change the culture here, Evans. We need to hold everyone accountable, not just those who are easy targets." Evans leaned forward, his interest piqued. "So, what do you need me to do?" Benny's eyes hardened. "I need you to help me make sure Grant and Lawson understand what's at stake. They need to see that what they did isn't just about a prank or a bad joke. It's about the kind of men they want to be, the kind of officers they want to become." Evans nodded slowly. "I get it, Chief. You're going to make them understand the weight of their actions." "Exactly," Benny said, his voice resolute. "And it's not just about punishment. It's about making them see what they're capable of when they choose the right path. They've got to know that this job, this badge, it's about protecting people, not pushing them down." Evans looked at Benny with newfound respect. "I'm in, Chief. I'll do whatever it takes." Benny smiled, feeling a sense of confidence rise within him. Evans was the ally he needed. Together, they would turn the precinct around. It was time to take the next step. Later that afternoon, Benny called a meeting with the entire precinct. Officers filed into the briefing room, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Benny stood at the front of the room, his gaze sweeping over the officers. There was an energy in the air, an electric tension that couldn't be ignored. They were all waiting for him to speak, but none of them knew what to expect. Benny waited for the room to quiet down, the murmurs slowly dying as all eyes turned to him. He wasn't just the chief of police anymore. He was the storm. "Everyone," Benny began, his voice cutting through the silence. "I'm here today to talk about something important, something that needs to change. Yesterday, 2 of our own decided to make a mockery of the badge, to treat one of our fellow officers like a joke. I won't stand for it. We're not here to play games. We're not here to pretend like this job is about us. This job is about the people we protect and the respect we show each other." There was a quiet murmur in the room. Some of the officers looked uneasy, but others were nodding in agreement. Benny could feel their uncertainty, but he wasn't about to stop now. "Grant and Lawson thought they could treat me however they liked. They thought they could chain me up and walk away without consequences. But let me tell you something," Benny's voice grew more intense, his gaze hardening, "this isn't about one man, one mistake. It's about every single one of us understanding what it means to wear this badge. To lead by example. To show respect. To be the kind of officers this town deserves." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Grant and Lawson will be held accountable. They will learn what it means to disrespect this badge and what it means to be a part of this team. But let me make one thing clear, this is a warning to everyone here. If you think you can take this badge for granted, if you think you can treat people however you like, then you're in the wrong place. I will not tolerate it. We're better than that." Benny's eyes swept across the room, meeting the gaze of each officer. "We are a team. And if one of us falls, we all fall. If one of us dishonors this badge, we all dishonor it. So let this be the moment when we all decide what kind of officers we're going to be. Because I will not let this precinct become a place of arrogance and disrespect. We will be a place of integrity. And I will lead us there." There was a heavy silence after his speech. Benny could feel the eyes of the officers on him, some unsure, some in agreement. But Benny knew one thing for certain, the wheels had been set in motion. And nothing at all, would stop what was coming next. The tipping point. The days following Benny's speech in the precinct had a peculiar atmosphere. Officers were more cautious, more aware of their surroundings, and perhaps most telling of all, they were starting to question themselves. The once confident, easy camaraderie that had defined the precinct's daily operations had been replaced with an underlying unease. Benny hadn't expected immediate transformation, it never worked that way. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and now, it was only a matter of time before things began to change, one way or another. Grant and Lawson, for their part, had been avoiding Benny since the meeting. Their once carefree attitude had been replaced by visible discomfort. Benny could see them trying to blend in, keeping their heads down, but their every move now felt calculated, as though they were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Benny wasn't in a rush. He didn't need to make an immediate example out of them. What mattered more was the shift in the precinct's dynamic, the quiet ripple that had spread through the ranks. They had felt the sting of his words, and whether they admitted it or not, they knew that things couldn't go back to the way they were. But Benny also understood the importance of action. Words alone wouldn't bring about change. He had to act, to show the officers that he meant what he said. And for that, he needed to push further. It was time to take things to the next level. Benny knew that if he was going to break through the shield of arrogance that still lingered in the precinct, he would have to take a hard line. It wasn't enough to punish Grant and Lawson and let them slink away into obscurity. No, he needed to make them understand the full weight of their actions. They had to feel the consequences, and they had to understand that this wasn't about revenge, it was about something deeper, something more profound, integrity. The perfect opportunity came when he was sitting in his office late one afternoon, going over the case files on his desk. It was a quiet day at the precinct, the usual bustle replaced by an eerie stillness. Benny was deep in thought, reviewing a cold case that had long since gone cold. His mind, however, was elsewhere, focused on the next steps for Grant and Lawson. He knew the moment was approaching when he would have to make his move. The door to his office creaked open, and Benny didn't even have to look up to know who it was. It was Officer Evans, his steady ally and confidant. The young officer had become Benny's sounding board, the one person he could rely on to see the bigger picture and who wasn't afraid to tell him the truth. Evans had proven his loyalty, and Benny trusted him completely. "Chief," Evans said, his voice carrying a hint of urgency. "We've got a situation." Benny didn't hesitate. He immediately set the file aside and gestured for Evans to take a seat. "What happened?" "It's Grant and Lawson," Evans said, his voice lowered, as though not wanting to be overheard. "They've been causing trouble. It's small stuff at first, but it's building. They're starting to rally some of the younger officers, the ones who haven't been around long enough to understand what we stand for here. They're questioning your authority. They think it's just a temporary thing, that if they wait long enough, this will blow over." Benny's jaw clenched. He had been waiting for this moment, but the reality of it still hit him like a blow to the chest. Grant and Lawson hadn't learned their lesson. They hadn't taken the time to truly understand what Benny had tried to teach them. They thought they could still bend the rules, play the game, and wait for the storm to pass. "What kind of trouble are we talking about?" Benny asked, his voice calm, though a storm was brewing inside him. "Nothing overt," Evans explained, "but it's enough. They've been spreading rumors, questioning your leadership in private. They're making comments to the newer officers about how things used to be, about how you're too strict, too hard on them. It's causing a division in the ranks." Benny leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk. "I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. It's not a full-blown rebellion," Evans continued. "But it's there. And if you don't act now, it could get worse. The younger officers are starting to listen to them, Chief." Benny stared out the window for a moment, lost in thought. The feeling of betrayal gnawed at him, but he knew he couldn't afford to be emotional about this. This wasn't just about Grant and Lawson anymore, it was about the future of the precinct. Benny had built his career on earning respect, not demanding it. But now, the time for patience was over. He needed to act decisively. "I'll handle it," Benny said, his voice cold and final. "But I need you to help me. We can't let this get out of hand." Evans nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Benny stood up from his desk, walking toward the window again. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and Benny felt a surge of resolve fill him. "It's time to make an example of them. I need to show them that insubordination, even in its smallest form, won't be tolerated." Evans hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You're going to take them off duty, right?" Benny turned to face him, his eyes sharp. "No. I'm not just going to pull them from duty. I'm going to put them on the front lines, on a case. Something high profile. I want them to see firsthand what real pressure looks like, what real responsibility is. They've been too comfortable, too entitled. I'm going to show them what it means to truly serve. And I want them to understand that they're only as strong as the team they stand with." Evans's eyes widened. "You're going to put them in the field?" "Yes," Benny replied. "They need to see the weight of this job. They need to understand what it means to carry the badge, not just wear it." With that, Benny's plan was set into motion. He wasted no time in assembling the officers for a briefing. As the rest of the precinct gathered in the meeting room, Benny stood before them, his presence commanding their attention. "This precinct is built on a foundation of trust and respect," Benny began, his voice ringing with authority. "Anyone who thinks they can undermine that, anyone who thinks they can undermine me or the values we stand for, will learn the hard way that there are no shortcuts in this job." His gaze fell on Grant and Lawson, who stood stiffly at the back of the room, avoiding his eye contact. Benny felt their tension, but he didn't flinch. The time for coddling had passed. "You two," Benny continued, addressing them directly, "are going to be assigned to a high-risk operation. You'll be working alongside the rest of the team, on the front lines. I hope this experience will help you understand what it truly means to serve and protect. There will be no more room for arrogance. No more room for excuses." Grant's face turned pale, and Benny could see the fear creeping into his eyes. Lawson shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting the decisions that had led them here. But Benny wasn't concerned with their remorse. This was about teaching them a lesson they would never forget. It was about reminding them that in this line of work, they weren't above the rules, they were held to a higher standard. As Benny dismissed the meeting and watched the officers file out of the room, he knew that the next few days would be critical. This was the moment that would define the future of the precinct. If Grant and Lawson could rise to the challenge, they might just redeem themselves. But if they failed, they would be gone. And Benny wouldn't hesitate to remove them from the force if it came to that.